One of the things that the Eldrazi decks have had a problem with in the past is they are limited to colorless mana only and colorless options because most of the Eldrazi are straight up colorless for their legends. However, now with the Eldrazi Incursion Precon, we now have access to 5 color Eldrazi's, so now we have access to all kinds of spells that we can add to the deck. Now, fair warning, Eldrazi's are a very popular creature type, and therefore it's also a very expensive thing to upgrade. And this deck is also the most marked up version of these precons out there. So if you can find it a little bit cheaper, go for it, but don't pay the heavy markups that are currently going on with this precon. That said, let's see what kind of horrors we can inflict upon our opponents with this deck, as well as our wallets. Let's kick this off by looking at the commanders for the deck, starting with Ulalek Fused Atrocity, which is all 5 colors or 5 colorless or some variation thereof, as it is a hybrid mana. Eldrazi, it has Devoid, so the card has no color. And whenever you cast an Eldrazi spell, you can pay 2 colorless. If you do, copy all spells you control, and then copy all other activated abilities and triggered abilities you control, and you can choose new targets for the copies, but you can't copy mana abilities, and it's a 2/5. Ulalek is an Eldrazi copying machine. For 2 colorless mana, you can create a token copy of any Eldrazi that you cast. Even if the original is countered, you're going to get this token copy. Not only that, you also get a copy of any cast trigger that was created when you cast the original Eldrazi. So for example, you cast an Oblivion Sower, which comes in the precon. You can pay the colorless cost, and then you get 2 copies of the Sower and 2 copies of the Sower's cast trigger, which is to exile an opponent's top 4 cards, and you get any lands in those 4 cards on your side of the board. So you can see how strong this could be. Then we have the second commander, and one that has been called unfun, quote unquote, due to what it does. With Azlask, the Swelling Scourge. For 3 colorless, it's an Eldrazi that says whenever it or another colorless creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. And you can pay 1 of each color. Creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of experience counters that you have, and Scions and Spawns you control gain Indestructible and Annihilator 1 until end of turn, and this is a 2/2. The salt that comes up for this would be that Annihilator 1 activation being added to every Eldrazi Scion and Spawn that you have, and if you build this deck right, you can come away with a deck that is just downright nasty, as there's a number of cards that can make those tokens, and this ability stacks up. So if you can have multiple ways of making all 5 colors repeatedly, you could get 2 or 3 or even more instances of Annihilator on each of those tokens, and the game will rapidly end with your opponents not having much left as the Eldrazi munch on their boards. So with all that said, we're going to focus on Ulalek with this video, but like the other Modern Horizon 3 Precon videos, I'm going to give some suggestions for an Azlask variation of the deck at the end. So let's start off with my first cut, and it's a card that's better with Azlask, and that is Skittering Invasion. We're going to be cutting a few of these more expensive Scion/Spawn creators, simply because they just don't do much with Ulalek, and this isn't the deck I want to play those kind of things in. Instead, we're going to add more Eldrazi that are big and have cast triggers for Ulalek to copy. The first of which is going to be Conduit of Ruin. It's a 5/5 for 6, which isn't all that exciting. But being able to search up most of the creatures in this deck that are 7 mana or value or higher is really good. And even better when you can copy it for a couple more colorless mana with Ulalek, getting a second creature fetched up is really good as well. And the icing on the cake here is that the first spell we cast on later turns are discounted by 2 or 4 if you copied this. The second cut from the deck is one of those that I have to say I like the card and I like what it does, but not in this deck the way I want to build it. Bismuth Mindrender is in a line of cool cards that you can cast spells with life instead of mana if you meet certain criteria, but in this case you hit the opponent, you get to cast with life instead of mana. But there's 2 things here that are pushing it out of the list for me. First off, you're not able to cast your own spells, but instead of cards that you exile off an opponent's deck that you've hit with it, and then you get to cast it once you get something that you can cast. If this was a spell theft deck, I'd be all for it, but in this case, I want to cast my own stuff. Secondly, this deck just has 1 card in it that gains you life, Suffer the Past. So if you get too many hits off of this, trying to use it too many times, you won't have any reliable way to pull your life back up as the deck is set up. So once more, I'm going to add another Eldrazi that has a cast trigger for Ululek to abuse with Flare of Loyalties. It's a 10 cost threaten effect that can swipe a creature from an opponent and essentially put an Eldrazi conscription on it until end of turn and grants it haste, so you could immediately swing with it. Copying this with Ululek is going to cause all kinds of havoc for someone, as you then you'll be able to have 2 of these on the board, steal 2 of their creatures, turning them into 10/10s with Trample, Haste, and Annihilator 2. You can also do a little trick with these because they don't have to target something that an opponent controls. It just says target creature. So if they don't have something for you to steal, you can hit up one of your littler Eldrazi's or like a Scion token or something like that and turn them into 10/10 trampling, annihilating monsters to smash for a turn. Either way, this thing is really good in this deck. Next up on the chopping block is going to be Ulamog's Crusher. It doesn't have a cast trigger to copy, and it's just kind of generic for what we could have access to. So instead, I want to add something to the deck that can make for some absurd lines of play by using a Vedalken Orrery. One of the things about Ululek is that when you cast and pay for its trigger, it copies all spells and triggers on the stack, but most of the spells in the deck that are creatures without flash. So it's hard to chain things into the effect. However, the Orrery gives all of our stuff flash, so you can respond to each trigger and activation on the stack, making it so that you can spin extra spell and creature copies at instant speed and get a little more out of hand with this if you have enough mana to do so. Now, the next card might be a little more controversial as a cut, but there's a lot of people excited about this card, and it's good in certain decks. However, not in this one, and that is Mutated Cultist. If this deck had included something like Dark Depths, I probably would have considered leaving it in as a combo with it, but we don't have anything here that we want to pull counters off of. And as for our opponents, there aren't many things you want to remove from them outside of either energy or experience counters. If those are the kind of decks you're facing, you might want to have this left in the deck, but I don't see them that often in my own LGS, making this kind of a mediocre card in most cases. So instead, we're going to dip into the main Modern Horizons 3 set and slot in Echoes of Eternity. It's the new Kindred enchantment that copies triggers of colorless spells and permanents, as well as copying colorless spells, giving us a version of Ululek without paying for that trigger. And it can also copy things that aren't creatures, unlike Ululek, like artifacts and other colorless spells within the deck. You can play this, like an Eldrazi Conscription, you get 2 of them. That Annihilator trigger that's on there is if you've enchanted a colorless creature, it's going to get copied as well. Yeah, this thing can get super silly. Another card in the deck that just doesn't quite do enough for us is Vile Redeemer. The idea with this commander is to copy our Eldrazi and their cast triggers, but with the Redeemer, you're not likely going to have anything to do with that because you're relying on your stuff dying, non-tokens no less. And after you've cast this, the board has likely been wiped away, and Ululek's not going to be there to copy the Vile Redeemer. And the thought of getting 4 or 5 Scions just isn't enough for losing those 4 or 5 bigger Eldrazi. So I'm going to go ahead and slot in another new card from the main set with Null Drifter. It's a nice flying threat. The card draw is rolled into that one, and it has a nice flexibility being able to be evoked to get at the cards in a pinch. And it's just, it's really good. And having Ululek being able to copy it just gives you more value. Now, at the risk of starting to sound like a little bit of a broken record, we have another card that just isn't where we want to be in the deck with Drowner of Hope. We're not really focused on Scion creation to get a ton of mileage out of that tap activation, and I'd rather use the Scions for mana to cast more expensive things if I'm going to sacrifice them. So instead, we're going to use Mockery of Nature, an Eldrazi that has a cast trigger to copy and that can be discounted by using its emerge cost by sacrificing something that's outlived its usefulness. And this will give us a little more artifact and enchantment removal while being better to use with Ululek's ability. Then we have another kind of controversial pull I want to take out of this. It's one of the new cards. In a build where Scions on spawns were the focus, Angelic Aberration would be a great include, but in this version of the deck, we've de-emphasized the Scions and the spawns because we're using Ululek instead, and so it's not nearly as strong here, and instead we're going to be dipping back into the main set for Thief of Existence. It's another copyable Eldrazi with a cast trigger that exiles non-creature, non-land permanents, and I wouldn't be afraid to use this one early if you need to in order to slow an opponent down, but if you draw it later with Ululek around, you're going to be able to hit multiple things with it. And then our next cut is another card that I just feel doesn't do enough for the deck overall, and that is Warping Whale. The handful of times that you might counter something with this, it'll feel pretty good, but otherwise I'm unimpressed with this card, and I always have been. I needed room for something that I really wanted in a deck, and that's why it's coming out for Rhythm of the Wild, so that I can prevent blue mages from counting my expensive Eldrazi and to give them haste to smash with them faster as a way to duck removal. So if you haven't figured it out by now, Azlask is not going to be part of this build since we're not focusing on the Scion and Swarm angle, but its replacement will be another legend that comes from the Commander Masters Precon, Zul'Dok Voidgorger. This is our most expensive recommendation for the deck. Since we're focusing on the larger Eldrazi, we're going to get more bang for our buck from Zul'Dok, double cascading each time since the cascade granted is a cast trigger and it's copyable by Ulek itself as well. And then the last cut for the build I'm making is Ancient Stirrings. Now, I dislike cards where you have to reveal a card, pick one, and then bury the rest on the bottom of your deck. Too often they either brick out and you get nothing for the mana, or you pull multiple things that you really want to have, and then you have to pick one and put the rest out of reach for the rest of the game. So rather than do that, I'm going to play Barrage Tyrant. While it's not an Eldrazi that has a cast trigger, the reason for it here is to fling your creatures at an opponent to finish them off for a 2 and a red. So say your 7 power Eldrazi is getting removed, fling it at the caster. Need to finish someone off, swing and fling. It's just a good card, and I'm more than happy to include it here now that we have access to colors in the Eldrazi deck. Now, some of you might wonder, where are the Eldrazi Titans? I'm not recommending them for this build because of Ulek's copying trigger. You can get the cast triggers off of them, but then you'll have to sacrifice the copy because it's still legendary. It doesn't shut off that legendary thing, and I don't want to build a deck where I have to add extra cards just to get rid of that clause to keep them around. It'll also save you a little bit of money not focusing on them as part of the build, since you're going to be dropping a hefty amount to get all of them. But if you already have some of them, however, feel free to grab them and put them in the deck. Now, as promised, here are a few cards that I would play if I wanted to focus the deck more on Azlask and the Scion and Spawn tokens. Some of the cards that I had already cut out would be put back into the deck to, keep the Scion generation going, but I'd also add some of these cards as well, such as Doubling Season. This thing will not only double our token creation of the Scions and Spawns, but it also doubles up that experience counter trigger off of Azlask. I'd also include Blight Herder. It's a reasonably costed 4/5 for 5 that can also get us 3 Scions if you put 2 cards from exile into your opponent's graveyards. It does not have to be the same opponent either. It can be multiple opponents. And that can be things exiled via removal, or even cards that were sent to exile by an impulse draw, adventure cards, or even plot cards from Thunder Junction. All kinds of possibilities here with this one. We're also going to include a card that I already recommended for the other version of the build here, and that is Echoes of Eternity. I'm going to play it here as well. Those Annihilator triggers granted by Azlask to the tokens will be doubled since the Scions and Spawns are colorless, and Azlask's experience counter trigger will be doubled as well because he is colorless as well. Then we're going to circle into the main set and hit a couple of cards there. First up is Idol of the False Gods. It's a small mana sink to make spawns for us, and as the creatures die, it's going to eventually turn into an Eldrazi creature once it hits 8+1/+1 counters. That also has Annihilator 2, and then we're also going to include Propagator Drone. This gives all of our Scions and Spawns evolve, so as we're playing our other bigger Eldrazi and stuff, they're going to grow in size, as well as being a mana sink to create more spawns for us. We're also going to include Ruination Guide, which is a static +1/+0 pump for all of our colorless creatures to help the little tokens along. I also want to include a copy of Smothering Abomination. This thing is on-demand draw with all these Spawns and Scions. Sack 1 for mana, and then with this on the board, you get a card with minimal downside of having to sacrifice a creature on your upkeep. I also want to include what has been deemed an all-star in the limited format so far with Writhing Chrysalis. This thing is just going to make a great play here as well. It makes spawns on the way in, and as we sacrifice our tokens, it'll grow into a threat that can swat down any flying pests that come at us. And then my last recommendation is actually going to be one of the new Eldrazi Titans, Kozilek the Broken Reality. For this list, I'm going to suggest this simply for its pump ability. You're going to turn your Spawns into 3/3s base without anything else going on, and Scions into 4/3s, which is not a small deal, and can act kind of as a Crater Hoof type effect in the deck, as well as netting us card draw. So that's what I had for you guys for the Eldrazi Incursion Precon. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Did I miss something? Is there something I shouldn't have cut that you felt should have been left in one of the builds? Is there something I overlooked? Let me know down below. And as always, thank you for watching. Have a great day, and I will see you in the next video.